Good evening, colleagues, friends, and distinguished guests from all over the world, and particularly the guests of Professor Cornel West, who have come to join him here in Edinburgh for this amazing series of Gifford lectures that we've all been enjoying. As I said earlier on, we have a live stream and people will be watching in real time, or of course sometime thereafter. And that's made this such an exciting experience for us to have the sense of engagement from many different parts of the world, both in the room, as it were, and also outside the room. My name is Jo Shaw. I hold the Salveson Chair of European Institutions. I'm head of Edinburgh Law School, and I'm a member of the Gifford Committee. And it's in that final capacity that I have the privilege of chairing tonight's lecture. I want to just draw your attention to remind you of the distinction of Professor Cornel West, but I don't think there's really anyone in this room who needs reminding of that. He's the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Professor of Philosophy and Christian Practice at the Union Theological College, and he's been delivering a series of brilliant, truly brilliant, in every sense of the word, Gifford lectures here in Edinburgh over the last 10 days or so, and this is lecture number 5, so there's one more lecture to come on Thursday, and I hope you'll be able to make that as well. So this is lecture number 5, America, Allegro Molto Vivace. In this lecture, Professor West is going to open with the inauguration of philosophy in the West. In his responses to Greek catastrophes, including the Peloponnesian Wars, Plato provided profound resources for our own catastrophic moment. To be sure, Plato's fear of disorder and unruly passions and his denigration of history blurred his lens and could blind him to the catastrophic and tragicomic. And yet Plato also understood that when suddenly, like a blaze kindled by a leaping spark, it is generated in the soul and at once becomes self-sustaining, philosophy could become redemptive and, in Professor West's conception, jazz-soaked and freestyle. Thank you very much. Please join me in a round of applause to welcome Professor Cornel West. Thank you.
Oh, what a blessing. What a blessing. You all again are just so very kind. No, this is number 5. And I'm having more fun each time. So I salute each and every one of you and look forward to being challenged and unsettled as I've tried to challenge you and unsettle you. We have finally made our way to what used to be called the New World, but is now just another part of the world. And I'm talking about not just the Western Hemisphere, but I'm talking about the USA. And you can imagine someone like myself to be able to stand here on an international stage and talk about the American empire, that whatever I say, I have to acknowledge the degree to which I have to say something that includes myself. So it can't be an absolute condemnation. It might be a strong critique with a lot of righteous indignation. But the tradition that produced me, the jazz-soaked philosophy that flows from the doings and sufferings of black people on the underside, and in many ways also at the center of the shaping of the American empire, is one that is as American as so many of the crimes that have been committed against we black people and indigenous people and working people and so forth. So I want to begin with a quote from the great Henry James. He wrote a letter on January 12, 1901 to Robert Louis Stevenson. The great Robert Louis Stevenson, graduate of this institution of 1895. He said, "No theory is kind to us that cheats us of seeing, no theory is kind to us that cheats us of seeing. So much of my attempt to talk about the vocation of jazz-soaked philosophy has to do with to get us to see things more deeply, clearly, synoptically, analytically, and connected to feeling things more deeply and intensely, hearing things and listening to things, and then most importantly, true to pragmatism, which is the indigenous philosophical tradition of the American empire that always puts forward a primacy of phronesis and practical reason, doing, acting more courageously. Now, Adorno has a wonderful line in Dwarf Fruit in Minimum Moralia, Reflections on Damaged Life. He says, the splinter in your eye is the best magnifying glass. Again, one of the drum beats of these lectures. Intellectual humility on the one hand, Socratic self-examination and self-scrutiny, but also that splinter, and of course it's an echo from the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 7, and the Sermon on the Plain, Luke 6, where it talks about the moot and the beam. But that splinter also has to do with what? The suffering inside of you. The ways in which you, all of us, must come to terms with forms of catastrophe on the personal, interpersonal, structural, institutional, political, economic, spiritual levels. And so Adorno has a double sense of that splinter in the eye. The lens through which we view the world on the one hand, and whatever lens we adopt, there'll be shortcomings. Whatever lens we adopt, there will be some myopia, some short-sightedness. But then there is the challenge. And this comes from the great George Eliot of Middlemarch. And I always like to include that subtitle, A Study on Provincial Life, with a stress on the roots. That's Marie Evans, George Eliot. She says, if in fact we were ever able to have a keen vision and feeling of ordinary human life, it would be like hearing the grass grow or the squirrel's heartbeat, and we would die from the roar on the other side of silence. So there's this sense of Dostoevsky in the backdrop. If we ever think that we could see everything with the multi-layered forms of suffering and misery and wounds and bruises and scars, that might be too much. So the question becomes, how do we use our timing, just like a jazz woman or a blues man, to see just enough to get at enough of the truth? And the condition of any of that truth-telling is to allow the suffering to speak of others and ourselves, but also recognize that if we could really see what George Eliot calls those frequencies, or Ralph Ellison would call the lower frequencies of the unbelievable forms of suffering in the world, we would be thoroughly overcome. How do we walk that tightrope in rhythm with syncopation and sophistication, and especially in what used to be called the New World? And I keep coming back to that because, you know, we Americans, we so easily overlook the degree to which the early years of our settler colonial experiment was one in which we had profound inferiority complexes vis-a-vis Europe. Ralph Waldo Emerson put forward that cultural declaration of independence in the American Scholar. We've listened too closely to the courtly muses of Europe. We need to think for ourselves. We need to be ourselves with our own hands, through our own lens, I would add. And that reflects in so many ways an acknowledgement that there's a sense in which the early moments of the U.S. experiment was a neo-European moment. And that connection is very important. Of course, I don't need to add this in regard to University of Edinburgh and the Scottish Presbyterians, because Brother Jeff and I taught at Princeton for 40 years. So there's a whole lot of Scotsmen that we interact with when we leave Firestone Library, right? The Witherspoons and others. Yes, indeed. The neo-Europeans, who then have to come to terms with un-European circumstances and conditions. The indigenous peoples, the African slaves, or the enslaved Africans, I should say, the working classes from various parts of Europe and Asia and around the world. And then that wilderness with that dominant myth in the making of the American empire, which is the frontier. Frederick Jackson Turner, the most distinguished of all American historians in many ways. And what is the frontier? That line of demarcation between the civilized and the so-called savages, the language used by Thomas Jefferson in the U.S. Constitution. We're constituting this empire of liberty over against the savages. And this frontier being a pioneer, path blazer, moral regeneration, unbelievable levels of vitality and vibrancy and energy, but also tied to violence, rationalized by a discourse of innocence. James Baldwin says over and over again, innocence itself is the crime, because it doesn't allow us to see all the pamphlets put forward, the early waves of European settlers. No human beings here, just buffaloes and Indians. I think you need a deeper perception of what is real and what is true. There's no way that I could get to Eugene O'Neill or T.S. Eliot. I'm just putting these up. This is not an advertisement, but I just want you to be able to see texts that mean very much to me in the shaping and molding of who I am and how I view the world, and how I feel and hear and listen, even given my critiques of them. But there's no way I could get to them before I briefly trot out a brook of fire and a rose garden of thorns. Emerson is the brook of fire through which one must pass before one has any serious reflection on what American and U.S. culture is all about. And Melville is the rose garden of thorns. Very, very different from the same soil. Different in temperament, different in sensibility, inextricably bound. And we're going to see this so clearly on Thursday, when we see the ways in which the height of the Melvillian tradition, Toni Morrison, the height of the Emersonian tradition, James Baldwin, and what I'll have to say about him in relation to W.E.B. Du Bois. So when we're talking about America, and even though we have different sessions for the vanilla and the chocolate ones, I want us to always recognize the ways in which they are intertwined. It's hybrid all the way down. It's interdependent, mediated with conflict and contestation all the way down. And then there's no better shorthand than to go back to May 25th, 1903, which was the 100th anniversary of the birth of Ralph Waldo Emerson. And two of the towering figures, William James and John Dewey, put forward their reflections on the godfather of American letters, Ralph Waldo Emerson. William James was the godson of Emerson. William James's father, Henry James Sr., graduate of Princeton Theological Seminary. I'm still looking at one of the distinguished presidents of Princeton Theological Seminary right now, Brother Ian Torrance. I'm thinking of my dear brother Jonathan Walton, who I so deeply respect and love now, president. Well, Henry James Sr., with his one leg, God bless him, graduated from that place. He was about as idiosyncratic and iconoclastic as you could imagine, but he produced some fascinating children. Alice is probably more interesting than Henry and William, but we won't get into that right now. But 100 years, William James was asked to say something in the very hamlet that produced Emerson, Concord, Massachusetts. He remembers being in Mr. Emerson's room in Washington Square, which is where they had the big James Mansion in New York City, as a child, talking to the old man, Ralph Waldo Emerson. And he begins with death, another drumbeat in this lecture series. He says, what happens when the pathos of death reduces a man to a musical note? And his spiritual voice has to be gained through our hearing that musical note in this musical museum. He says he was a real seer, S-E-E-R. He was a real seer. He was an artist. His medium was verbal. His material was spiritual. And he says, as long as there is the English language, what he wrote will cheer people's hearts and strengthen their souls and liberate them from whatever forms of provincialism and parochialism. It's one of the most beautiful tributes of a towering philosopher to a man of letters. He says, Emerson called himself a poet, so I'll call him a poet. Philosopher, I won't even get into the controversy, but he would implicitly leave that to John Dewey, because that same day in the University of Chicago, Brother Julian, where you were trained, Dewey gives the great lecture. Dewey, one of the most non-lyrical of American philosophers, nowhere near Quine's lyricism, nowhere near George Santayana's magnificent and majestic prose. But that day, he sounded almost like Wallace Stevens. Unbelievable. Is this the same John Dewey writing? The spirit must have hit that brother from Vermont. And what does he say? Emerson presents to us a way of transcending the debate between philosophy and poetry, where this lecture series started. He said these petty partitionings, these petty divisions between literature and metaphysics, between philosophy and poetry, he transcends that. Then what is he? He is a spiritual seer. He revels in the deliverances of intercourse more than the reasonings of discourse. And that means he's not going to fit well in philosophy departments, Brother Jeremy and others, we understand. We want reasoning. We want analytical clarity. We want rigorous thinking. Well, Ralph Emerson is not the place to go for that. John Dewey says, but he then goes on to say, he said, he's the only name that can be invoked in the New World alongside Plato's. I think that's hyperbolic and exaggerated, but no. Plato is John Coltrane, and Emerson is Ben Webster, but both of them, all four of them, giants beyond category. But the important part is this, that for us concerned about catastrophe, structures of domination and forms of subjugation and so forth. Catastrophe, death of loved ones, betrayal of friends. Catastrophe, wrestling with that distinctive form of American loneliness that de Tocqueville talked about in that wonderful chapter. Why is it that Americans are so restless in the midst of prosperity? They suffer from a form of spiritual quietude. They suffer from a form of being unable to cultivate the kind of philia that constitutes quality relationships. They suffer from a Hamlet-like disease in which maybe they even no longer cultivate the capacity to love, to be intimate and vulnerable. Spiritual deserts. T.S. Eliot, hollow men and women. Cruel, vacuous, spiritual wastelands. What is it about this new experiment? This new social experiment, this early neo-European experiment in non-European circumstances. What will it provide to world civilization? What will it provide to the global discourse of wrestling with what it means to be human? What forms of paideia would flow therefrom? We come to jazz-soaked philosophy. We come to folk who explicitly or implicitly will be in conversation with the issues raised by the Platos and the Aristotles and the Horaces and the Pindars and the Augustines and the Aquinas and the Shakespeares and the Rabelais and the Erasmuses and the Tolstoys, and especially the Chekhovs. That's my own personal prejudice that I think you all understand at this point, because I trot it out every lecture. And if we had a seventh lecture, it would be all Chekhov in black folk. Because that's where I reside as a Jesus-loving free black man produced by the American empire in conversation with voices all around the world. So we move then to the two towering intellectuals, not philosophers, but intellectuals dealing with the three pillars of jazz: catastrophe, swing, improvisation. It's hard to find a philosophical analog to Eugene O'Neill or T.S. Eliot. It's fascinating when you think about it. It really is. We've had some magnificent American philosophers. There's no doubt about that. Josiah Royce wrote a book on race problems. He had a nervous breakdown in New England and took a boat to Australia and discovered they had a race problem. And you said, Josiah, did you live in Boston and Cambridge? You had to go all the way down there to talk about race problems? Just cross the Charles River and go to Roxbury. Well, that's an interesting point, Brother West, from the grave. I want to speak for myself on that one. Denial, innocent, evading, catastrophe. It's hard to find even as we move into the middle part of the 20th century. Figures. And Brother Jeff Stout has written magnificently on Baldwin and Ellison. It's very, very rare. Very rare indeed. We've had magnificent black philosophers like Alain Locke, Eugene Fontaine, a host of others. I've talked about some of them the first week. Lucius Outlaw and the others. But if you want sustained wrestling with catastrophe in American letters, literary, poetic forms, Emerson on the one hand, especially Melville. But Emerson has an underside. He has a grimness. He has a darkness. He's concerned about the removal of indigenous peoples in the Cherokees. He spoke with Frederick Douglass, the same Frederick Douglass who came here in 1846 and was part of the Send Back the Money crusade of the free church, receiving that money from the barbaric slaveholders of my people. That's the same Frederick Douglass that Emerson stood next to and gave his famous reflections on a vanilla brother named John Brown who loved black people more than some black people loved themselves because of his willingness to die in the name of a truth that he didn't just speak, but as a Christian freedom fighter who believed that those black babies who were being crushed in Virginia had the same status as his own sons, and he took his sons and they died too. Yes, that's the Frederick Douglass and Emerson together with the pupil Henry David Thoreau. Very much so. But then we get to my dear vanilla Irish blues man. I love this brother. He hurts me every time I read him because he believes, in fact, that the very fiduciary dimension of being human is not enough. He says this particular text is the denial of all forms of faith, not just religious faith, but the fiduciary dimension, any trust, any faith whatsoever. And he says, my master is Nietzsche. Nietzsche changed my life right after I tried to kill myself. And I continued reflecting on whether I should kill myself for the next 40-some years. My son would. My other son would try. My brother did. Unbelievable catastrophe in his personal life. That's Eugene O'Neill, a Princeton man who stays for one semester because he drinks himself almost to death. We don't recommend that to our Princeton undergrads. That's Eugene O'Neill. And when they ask him, and they put him on the cover of Time magazine in 1946, and the first time he speaks to the whole nation as a playwright. He'd already won the Nobel Prize in 1936. He'd already written a whole host of plays, Beyond the Horizon, and Paul Robeson, Emperor Jones, and All God's Children Got Wings. Beautiful play that T.S. Eliot wrote a review for in the Criteria of April of 1926. But the first time he speaks, this is what Eugene O'Neill has to say. I'm going on the theory that the United States, instead of being the most successful country in the world, is the greatest failure. And that's not what Henry Luce had in mind, who was the editor and owner of Time magazine, who had talked about the American century. And this is what Eugene O'Neill says. It's the greatest failure because it was given everything, more than any other country. Though moving as rapidly as it hasn't acquired any real roots. Its main idea is that everlasting game of trying to possess your own soul by the possession of something outside of it, thereby losing your soul and the thing outside of it too. America is the prime example of this. because it happened so quickly and with such immense resources. This was really said in the Bible much better. We Americans are the greatest example of what shall it profit a man if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul. We had so much and could have gone either way. That's not how you become highly popular in a country addicted to innocence and lies about itself and believes that it can sustain itself on the efficacies of lies that hides its crimes. That's Eugene O'Neill. He would go on to say, I do want to be very careful about this. He says, the playwright today must dig at the roots of the sickness of today as he feels it, the death of the old God and the failure of science and materialism to give any satisfying new one for the surviving primitive religious instinct to find a meaning for life in and to comfort its fears of death with. So that artist becomes a kind of a physician of the soul, wrestling with the inability to provide meaning. The Iceman Cometh is probably, in the eyes of many critics, the most nihilistic play written in the last 75 years or so. And you say, how could that be? I thought the Russians were on the cutting edge of nihilism. How can that be? Is it really more nihilistic than his master, August Strindberg? Didn't he say in his 1936 Nobel Prize? Maybe I should read that to you too, so you don't think I'm just making this stuff up here. Absolutely. He says, I'm proud of my debt to Strindberg, only too happy to have this opportunity of proclaiming it to his people here. In Sweden, for me, he remains as Nietzsche, remains in his fear of the master, capital M. Still to this day, more modern than any of us, still our leader. And it's my pride to imagine that perhaps the spirit of Strindberg musing over this year's Nobel Award for Literature may smile with a little satisfaction and find the follower not too unworthy of his master. Piety's been one of the drum beats of this lecture. Here it is again. Here it is again. It's like the frontispiece of Virgil's classic, as we mentioned before, with his father on the back. He ain't heavy, he's my daddy. Strindberg's not heavy on Eugene O'Neill's back. He's my master. We saw Rabelais say the same thing to Erasmus. On and on and on. Why? Because exemplars make such a fundamental difference. There's a wonderful book by a figure who I think had one of the finest theological minds of the 20th century. His name was H. Richard Niebuhr. His last book before he dies is called Faith on Earth. And it begins with the wonderful biblical text. Jesus returns and wonders, will there be any faith on earth? Not just Christian faith, any faith on earth. Will the nihilism cut so deep that the fiduciary dimensions of trust so thoroughly called into question that even the Hobbesian universe will be desirable because at least there's order. At least there's something holding back the anarchy. That's how grim and dim Eugene O'Neill is. And it's hard to find that among the philosophers. That's why I'm talking about him at a Gifford lecture. And how does he begin his text? Eugene O'Neill says, pay up, I'll be glad to pay up. Now, who is Larry? Larry is the philosopher, echoes of Erasmus. The philosopher. We're at Harry Hope's saloon. I know I don't have time to go through the whole story, but very briefly. We're at Harry Hope's saloon with 12 persons, echoes of biblical texts, Lord's Supper, addicted, titillated, stimulated, alcohol, memories, nostalgia, and inertia, immobility, can't move. None of them can leave Harry Hope's saloon, all of them waiting for a messianic figure named Hickey, and Hickey is so all-American, namely he's a salesman. Just like Willie Loman's, the death of a salesman. Loman's has certain things to sell. Hickey is selling something even more American, dreams. Dreams he's selling. It reminds me in some ways of that Act Two of the great Stephen Sondheim is one of the few tragic comic artists in the history of musical theater, in Into the Woods, where he says, dreams may come true, but not free. There's a cost. There's a tremendous burden. And what is the dream of these folks? Simply to actualize their memories of the golden days when they were full of themselves and able to live much more ordinary lives. At the very beginning, this is how he says, this is Larry grinning, "I'll be glad to pay up tomorrow. I know my fellow inmates will promise the same. They're all a touching credulity concerning tomorrows. It'd be a great day for them. Tomorrow, the feast of all fools, capital F, with brass bands playing. Their ships will come in loaded to the gunwales and cancel regrets, promises fulfilled, clean slates, and new leases." And it's very interesting, especially being here in Scotland, that the brother named Jimmy Tomorrow says his speech is educated with the ghost of a Scotch rhythm in it. See, he's old world, moved to the new world, neo-European, being Americanized. And to be Americanized is what? To believe in tomorrow. It's like that next to last paragraph of F. Scott Fitzgerald's great text, the great Gatsby. Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgiastic future. Tomorrow will be better. Tomorrow will be bigger. Tomorrow will conquer. Tomorrow will be number one. Tomorrow will be on top. Really. And the past still haunts and beats back and is inescapable with its weight, with its gravitas. A past denied, but never a past completely eliminated. And what does Larry come back and say? He says, "Yeah, and a ton of hop." And Larry says, "Don't mock the faith. Have you no respect for religion? To hell with the truth. As the history of the world proves, the truth has no bearing on anything. It's irrelevant and immaterial, as the lawyers say. The lie of a pipe dream is what gives life to the whole begotten mad lot of us, drunk or sober, and that's enough philosophic wisdom to give you one drink of rock gut. The old fool-losopher. I suppose you don't fall for no pipe dream." "No, not me at all." "What do you mean?" "Well, I'm through with it. I was in the movement for 30 years. He's a leading leftist. He's a leading anarchist, just like Eugene O'Neill was with Mabel Dodge and a magnificent American called Dorothy Day in her secular years, who went on to become one of the towering freedom fighters after her conversion to Catholicism. And we'll see a similar conversion to Catholicism with Eliot, but with very different politics. "I'm through with the movement. I saw men didn't want to be saved from themselves, for that would mean they'd have to give up greed, and they'd never pay that price for liberty." It's a powerful line. That's a Dostoevskian line. Do human beings, do we really want to be free? Do we know what that means? Do we know the levels of cultivated capacity to be free, or do we simply want to follow Pied Pipers? The mystery transformed into manipulation. I'm referring, of course, to the Grand Inquisitor, that great prose poem that Dostoevsky wrote right before he dropped dead. And so I said to the world, God bless all here, and may the best man win and die of gluttony. I took a seat in the grandstand of philosophical detachment to fall asleep, observing the cannibals do their death dance. And we saw the reference to cannibals both with Montaigne and our dear brother Salt, living among the savages at Oxford and Cambridge. And we've got our savages at Princeton and Harvard and Yale. And my hunch is Edinburgh might have one or two too. Ain't I telling them the truth? My God, my God, my God. Where are we? He said, we're in No Chance Saloon, this Bedrock Bar, the end of the line cafe, the bottom of the sea, Rathkeller. Don't you notice the beautiful calm in the atmosphere? That's because it's the last harbor. Frontier, Pathblazer, Pioneer, last harbor. No one here has to worry about where they're going next because there's no further they can go. It's a comfort to them, although even here they keep up the appearances of life with a few harmless pipe dreams about their yesterdays and tomorrows. It's as harmless as a graveyard. And then here comes Willie, the Harvard Law dropout. He said, let us pray that Hickey, the great salesman, will soon arrive, bringing the blessed bourgeois long green. Well, that Hickey or death will come. Meanwhile, I'm going to sing a song, a beautiful old New England folk ballad where I picked up at Harvard amid the debris of education. And he goes on to say, there's a legend brooded about Cambridge laboratories that Waldo Emerson composed it during his uninformative period as a minister, while he was trying to write a sermon. It's very important to keep in mind. The dominant literary genre of American letters in its first waves: sermons, spiritual autobiographies. Eloquent. Talking, Brother Owen, about F.O. Matheson and that great classic of 1941, the American Renaissance. And you might remember that wonderful chapter in that text on eloquence that serves as one of the fundamental starting points and launching pads in that great classic. Because again, Cicero, again, Quintilian, again, eloquence, wisdom speaking, but also musically speaking. The music in the eloquence and both the how as well as the what. But in my opinion, it goes back much further, and Jonathan Edwards was the author of both words and music. He rapped and tapped enough to wake the dead till he heard a damsel over the window right over his head. Laughing at the icons. Harry Hope Saloon, 1912, New York City. Eugene O'Neill wrote this in 1939 in the Dow House overlooking San Francisco Bay. He hadn't published in years. He had retired. He wrote it in 1939, 1946. It was performed. They put him on the cover of Time in 1946. And what's going on, you've heard me say over and over again, the end of the age of Europe. Levels of bestiality and barbarity and war and catastrophe we don't have anywhere near a language for. Even Paul Celan and all of his genius could not come up with a language to come to terms with that level of barbarity. That's what this particular American looking at the world from the Dow House, almost like a panopticon in the Foucaultian sense, or in Jeremy Bentham's sense, keeping track of all of the low comedy of who we are as a folk. And then, and this is probably the most difficult thing, and I know it's getting late, because what Eugene O'Neill is trying to do is he's trying to call into question the very possibility of the Gifford lectures. That's serious. Because he's saying that paideia has no place because the truth itself kills. Paideia has no place. He says, because self-knowledge destroys the self. There's never a self strong enough to deal with self-knowledge. And if you really want to know the truth about yourself, you'll never be able to sustain yourself in the face of that truth. It's crypto, neo-Nietzschean. It's not Nietzsche. Hardly anybody gets Nietzsche right. Nietzsche didn't get Nietzsche right. We saw that with Plato. He's on the move too quick. He's got too many counter moves. The heresies are moving just as fast as the dogmas are. Nietzsche's the same way. But this is a particular appropriation mediated with the Swede, Strindberg. And this is based in many ways on the Dance of Death, part 1 and part 2 of Strindberg's. It's one of the most grimmest plays imaginable about love and hate between human beings. But it means, in fact, the paideia is completely trumped. Now, I know it's hard to use that word these days. But you got to just use your imagination, bracket off a particular individual, and say, trumped, foreclosed, no way out. There is no way out. Yeah, we should probably let that policeman go by here. Hope they're doing all right. But in the end, the result is what? In the end, the result, in fact, is wrestling with nihilism in its most concretized forms in a civilization where everything is for sale and everybody is for sale. Commodification on steroids, inseparable from vicious legacies of white supremacy and male supremacy and homophobia and transphobia and regional arrogance. You see, the American empire has a history of sections and regions as it was constituted as an empire. So if you're from Tennessee, it's a different trajectory in culture than if you're from Maine or Vermont. And you were incorporated in the empire at a very different moment. And even as you move from one country to the next with 330 million people, that's overlooked because it's so easy to homogenize the country and the empire in that way. No, historical specificity in the Gramscian sense is very, very important here, with all these different voices, as it were. But this is Larry at the end. And I'm going to read the directions of the great O'Neill. And he says, in a whisper of horrified pity, a long-forgotten faith returns to him. This is one of the very, very few moments of a fiduciary presence in this whole text. And again, just for a moment, and he mumbles, God rest his soul in peace. Oh, the damn pity, the wrong kind. Be God, there's no hope. I'll never be a success in the grandstand or anywhere else. Life is too much for me. I'll be a weak fool. Echoes Bront. Erasmus, again, echoes of Paul in a different sense, different kind of fool, Christian New Testament. Looking with pity at the two sides of everything till the day I die. May that day come soon. He pauses startlingly and surprised at himself. What is he surprised at? My God, it was a moment of faith. Alien to him. Doesn't know what to do with it. A threat. Living on the surfaces. Living a superficial mode of being in the world. For a moment, it looks like it, Kairos-like. Then it's gone. Then with a sardonic grin, he said, be God, I'm the only real convert to death. That Hickey, the salesman of dreams, who had actually killed his wife out of vicious hatred and misogyny. I'm the only real convert to death Hickey made here. From the bottom of my coward's heart, I mean that now. It does not get any grimmer. And it's not in any way something to simply push aside. You see, what Eugene O'Neill was trying to do was to say, in a land that is viewed as a land of unlimited possibility, and you hear it every January with presidents, there is no problem we cannot solve, no limit we cannot go beyond. How come? Because we are Americans. But that doesn't follow. We're Lithuanians. I see. Yeah. Where's this sense of hubris? You don't think that you're part of the same train of nations and empires that have been in place over time and space for centuries? You don't think that sooner or later the chickens will come home to roost and you're going to reap what you sow if you don't intervene in such a way that you cultivate individual and organizational capacities to produce what Dewey says about Emerson? What does he say? He says Emerson believed in the identity of being and character. That's soulcraft. That's paideia. That's what the Gifford lectures in so many ways is about. It's not academic discourse in natural theology. It's about how God talk can be informed in such a way with narratives and symbols deployed such that human beings in the short time that they're here can choose integrity, honesty, decency, generosity, love, compassion, critical engagement with a sense of laughter, and maybe with a little style. Maybe with a little style. Oh, what a challenge. So then when we turn to Thomas Stearns himself, my right-wing brother. Oh, yes. Got to keep track of him. Sometimes he downplays the rich humanity of our Jewish brothers and sisters, even though so many of his friends are Jewish. The New Criterion other places. Sometimes he's so high church he looks down on we low church folk. And yet we know in his poetry, he's got not just jazz-like movements, fluidity and liquidity, that he's got a deep appreciation of the words of the everyday people, and that no matter how much time he spends in London, he's still from St. Louis. You can't escape Tom. Not at all. And what is distinctive about this classic, we don't have time to go into it in the way that I would like, but this is almost 16 years after his conversion in June 1927 to what he called English Catholicism, High Church Anglicanism. After he's wrestled with catastrophes in his own life with his precious wife Vivian, wrestled with unbelievable pain and hurt as he's tried to conceive of himself as a poet with no training in English literature whatsoever, with a PhD in philosophy, with a dissertation written on F.H. Bradley, the British neo-Hegelian thinker, never published for the most part in most of his life, but a magnificent piece of philosophical work. Who could say April is the cruelest month? You all know the rest of it. That's 1922 with the Wasteland. Let Us Go. Oh, that's love song of proof rock that Brother Jeff wrote magnificent words when he was in high school, very precocious. Yes, indeed. What do you have to say now, Mr. Eliot, in the midst of the end of the age of Europe and the war which is raging? Time present and time past are both perhaps, that's Samuel Beckett's favorite word in English language. Perhaps. Just dwell on that a little bit. Perhaps present in time future, and time future contained in time past. If all time is eternally present, all time is unredeemable. But let us go to the rose garden. That's that Kairos moment where there's some kind of breakthrough, almost like a thunderbolt, almost like Jove in Vico's text, which forces us to respond creatively, not in the epistemic way only, but in an existential way, and fully dance. Then the lotus rose. Oh, I wish I had more time. At that still point of the turning world, neither flesh nor fleshness, neither from nor towards. At the still point, there the dance is. We've already talked about the way up, the way down as the epigraph, a part of the epigraph from Heraclitus. What do you mean? Well, this is going to be a descent, and that's what Burnt Norton is going to be all about. In the airy medium of words. He's going to be connecting it to air, providing some means by which maybe there is a way out by going up and down. It's clear that Eugene O'Neill could not find a way out. And it's a very, very sad affair when it comes to how he wrestled with this. Well, what do you come up with then? Well, he says there is, it seems to best, only a limited value in knowledge derived from experience. The knowledge imposes a pattern and falsifies, for the pattern is new in every moment. And every moment is a new and shocking valuation of all we have been. But there's no secure foothold, menaced by monsters, fancy lights, risking enchantment. Do not let me hear of the wisdom of old men. And that's white men, black men, brown men, whatever color. Don't act as if you can just invoke these great names and icons. They've got to prove something. Are they tried and true? Have they been able to generate something in you that William James saw Emerson generate in him? Do not let me hear the wisdom of old men, but rather of their folly, their fear of fear and frenzy, their fear of possession, of belonging to another or to others or to God. The only wisdom we can hope to acquire is the wisdom of humility. Humility is endless. And then my favorite line in this great poem, and this is a line that I talk so much with best friend I ever had in the world, James Melvin Washington. In fact, he put it on his gravesite. He died in 1997. Love him forever. He says, for us, there's only the trying. The rest is not our business. For us, there's only the trying. The rest is not our business. A lifetime burning in every moment, not the lifetime of one man only, but of old stones that cannot be deciphered. There's a time for the evening under starlight, a time for the evening under lamplight, the evening with the photograph album, maybe a jazz album. Love is most nearly itself when hear it now cease to matter. He's still himself trying to the best of his ability to cultivate that capacity to love. I know it's getting late, but let me just read just a little bit more because I'm on a roll with T.S. Eliot. Oh my God. This is how he's going out. And this leads directly into the jazz soap philosophy that we're going to talk about when we dwell and sustain ourselves on the black side of town and country with Toni Morrison and Baldwin and Du Bois. The dove descending breaks the air with flame of incandescent tear, of which the tongues declare, and one discharged from sin and air. The only hope, or else despair, lies in the choice of pyre or pyre to redeem by fire, by fire. Two different kind of fires here. Pentecostal fire, tied to some notion of not revelation, at least something that gives us a sense of transcendence beyond our narcissism and our hedonism, and the other fire being consumed by market-driven conceptions of the world in which you are completely set on superficial fire that has nothing to do with the deeper frequencies of your humanity. Who then devised the torment? Love. It took him so long to write this. This is what our dear Sister Gordon says in that magnificent biography she wrote. Mrs. Lindell Gordon. Love is the unfamiliar name behind the hands that wove the intolerable shirt of flame, which human power cannot remove. We only live, only suspire, sigh with a long breath, consumed by either fire or fire, and then hoping that the fire and the rose can be one. See, that's an attempt to get out of the catastrophic with a sense of poetic swing. Thoroughly improvisational in terms of how it's pulling from so many different traditions, so many different figures, and yet at the same time, as we shall see, inadequate. Just as anything we come up with will be in some sense inadequate. But we still, in the end, have to do something better than what Eliot or O'Neill or anyone in the past did. Thank you all so very much. Appreciate it.
Another tour de force, thank you so much. The way you blended together two unlikely fellows of O'Neill and Eliot in the context of rethinking the modern condition after the catastrophes of the First World War and the problems of the US and the paradoxical relationship between American and European modernity. That was really, really powerful. Thank you so much. We're going to pause the live stream and have a short 10-minute comfort break. I make it just before 25 to, so we'll reconvene in here sharply at 1:45, and then we will have time for a question and answer session. So thank you very much, and I guess the live stream will be paused. Great. I think we're probably ready to start again. Call Cornel back up here to take some questions. That was, as I said, that was an amazing tour de force with rich in primary sources as well as secondary materials, as well as these sort of the very definition of a Gifford lecture, which Jay Brown was taking down there and will be used forevermore in our Gifford committee. Great. So. There is a roving mic or two, I hope, and we just wait. Do you want to identify who would like to ask a question? Yeah, lots of them. Do you want to choose?
Sure.
Yeah, perhaps the gentleman at the front here.
Brother, absolutely.
Thank you, Professor. It was a fantastic and brilliant lecture, as ever. It strikes me that what you had to say briefly, but very importantly, I think, about hybridity, about the notion of hybridity in culture, has very important implications, because even for those of us who believe in liberation, who believe in progressive politics, I think we have to acknowledge that there is an exclusivist, reductionist sort of strand at this time that thinks of itself often in identity politics, that thinks of itself as new, but it's not new.
That's right.
Go back to the prolet cult in Russia, where some people wanted to just have workers' art only, reject the art and culture of the past. Or Senghor in Senegal, they wanted a negritude and essentialist Africanness, no white culture, please. And what you're saying, I think, goes against that essentialism, against that reductionism. You know, think of someone like Ousmane Sembène, the great Senegalese novelist and filmmaker. He draws for me on Émile Zola,
that's right,
as well as drawing on his African culture. He understands the need for hybridity. And that seems to me to be very important. That kind of, implicit in that is a moral and philosophical and cultural generosity, a movement back and forth, rather than an exclusion, rather than just an anger that is too often in our kind of contemporary progressive politics. I don't know what you think about that.
Oh, no, I think you said it eloquently, my brother. You're absolutely right. I mean, on the one hand, you know, when we think about hybridity, we're talking not simply about just a category or a construct, but you're talking about forms of courage that allow us to be willing to take a risk, to be self-critical, and embrace challenges that we encounter. See, so it's a practice in the deep Wittgensteinian Deweyan sense, you see what I mean? And therefore, it's going to be not, because see, I mean, one of the features these days of the professional managerial class when it comes to universities is that it's so easy to invoke categories, and it's so hard to enact them on the ground because you haven't cultivated the capacity to generate the kind of character such that you feel yourself strong enough to put yourself open to be criticized, to allow you to be critical. And so hybridity can be talked about over and over again by some of the most unhybrid folk in terms of how they behave. And that's something that needs to be said over and over and over again, because see, when you're talking about you know, jazz, blues, when you're talking about gospel, when you're talking about any forms of a people whose very praxis is trying to convince people to hold on with their sanity and dignity, that it's not an academic game at all. You see, something is at stake, bigger than your tenure, bigger than your status, bigger than your upward mobility. And once commodification, professionalization, specialization sets in, then you've got different kind of priorities. And it's inescapable. I'm not saying that we can never push it back, because none of us are innocent. That's why I started off, as you noted, with the self-critique, just like we started off with Erasmus with the self-parody, the critique of himself. Part of that best of the Socratic tradition in that way. And yet none of us, you know, are ever able to see certain things about ourselves that are worthy of criticism. That's part of the splinter in our eyes and so on. But absolutely, but I salute you as theater critic, though, brother. Very important. I know we talked about Sondheim during the break. And if I had a chance, as you can imagine, I mean, I'd spent a lot of time on Sondheim. He was my very dear brother. I've had many interviews with him. Tavis and I, we had our radio show, though, Brother Taz, we had Sondheim on. We invited Sondheim to go to William Patterson. We met to meet with all the jazz musicians. And he and I, we just had some magnificent conversations, because I think he's one of the giants and geniuses with a tragic sensibility and a musical theatrical genre that's known for the sentimental and known for the superficial. And sentimentality has its place. You know, it's just not true. But it does have its place. And I define sentimentality as the cultivation of specious emotion with no intention of execution. See, so it's superficial. But as a jazz person, you're open to a whole host of different forms. You just don't lie and think that it's profound. You like Lawrence Welk? Louis Armstrong loved Lawrence Welk. And he loved Guy Lombardo. Anybody say, Louis, that's the most superficial music in the world. You playing the most profound music in the world. I am who I am. Bubbles that Lawrence had, and Guy Lombardo. And it's so that all of us have our own ways of connecting and being honest and open if we have the courage to choose to to be ourselves in that way. But I salute you. And say hello to your precious son for me. Yeah, absolutely.
Brother Torrance, to have he's looking to ask you a question.
Yes.
Brother Ian.
Didn't write that. Absolutely.
No, right at the back. At the back. To the back. There.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and then him.
Then we're going to get a young brother in here.
Well, thank you for such a wonderful lecture. Now, John Donne, in one of his sermons, said that on the last day, God will wipe away the tear from every eye, but what will God do to those eyes that never wept? Now, I would suggest to you that what John Donne was saying was that catastrophe is not when tragedy falls to people, but when those to whom tragedy falls are unable to incorporate it into the ongoing struggle.
Oh, yeah, there's something I like about that, though. But I would have to think about that, my dear brother. I'm not sure that it's an either-or choice here. But I love your formulation of that question. And T.S. Eliot would love your invoking of a metaphysical poet like Donne in this context, because for so long he had been pushed to the margins by the Shelley lovers and others. And it seems to me that we can be either or there as well. Now, when it comes to what God is doing, wiping tears or whatever, mine is into trying to rest as God's business. I don't really know what's going on there. He said, I don't make any claims whatsoever. I'm just trying to be as jazz-like and loving as I could be in the short time before the worms get my body, my soul does what it does. So that I would say yes to your question. I like that. I like that formulation. I really do. I think it's both. And there are times, in fact, when we fall on our faces and cannot incorporate the impact of the catastrophe for a while. That's part and parcel of what it means to be human, too. You see, I don't want to give the impression that I have some kind of Promethean proclivity, that I'm forever stealing the fire and concerned about conquering. I leave that to Alexander the Great. No. That I'm a follower of a Palestinian Jew named Jesus that is one of self-surrender and self-emptying and self-sacrifice and a certain kind of humility that you've talked about, that Donne often talked about, certainly Eliot talks about. But it's tied to a tenacity of calling that leads me to be in the streets with this brother who's one of the great activists in this town as well, you see them. So that, in that way, you can see how it's deeply contextual, but it's part of the same human being trying to do the best of one's ability to be a force for good. Well, we don't have Coltrane's picture here, do we?
No.
No, okay. A force for good. We got our young brother here.
Yeah, and then we should maybe take a female question as well.
No, we should take the female question in before. Is that all right?
Yeah. And then you'll get the last question.
Absolutely. Indeed.
Yeah, I'm trying to spread it around and make it a bit more varied.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Hi. Okay.
It's all a bit random.
Okay. I didn't get to write it down, but in the beginning you asked a very powerful question about, what relationship should we be having with unbearable tragedy, the unbearable realities of our world, and how do we walk in rhythm on the tightrope and things like that. And in different ways, the writers and poets that you brought up engaged with this question, but I wanted to hear, I guess, more personally from you, to what extent should we be staring tragedy in the eye, and to what extent is that our responsibility? And I guess ultimately this is a question about whether or not despair can have a powerful role. should we be, in a sense, embracing despair and letting that transform us, or is there some preferable alternative relationship we should be having to truth? Thank you.
Thank you. Boy, that's a profound question. And as you can imagine, you see, I don't think that there's one general response to that kind of deep question. I think of Kierkegaard's great classic, one of the few texts that he actually signed his name to, called Works of Love. He talks about the one and the many. Love is one thing. That's a little Bob Marley, too. That's a little Frankie Beverly and Mays, one love. But it's also many, 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 many things. And it's differently enacted and embodied in different lives for different persons. So that one speaks from one's own experience, very Emersonian in some sense here. You speak from your own experience, learning, listening to others, but recognizing that there's no one grand model that everybody's trying to imitate or emulate, you see. In my case, I think phronesis is so inextricably tied to philia, friendship, love connections, eros, other kinds of love connections. So that, I love how you put it. You say you're walking on the tightrope in rhythm. Is that how you put that? See, that's it. No, I don't think I went. Did I say something like that? I did, don't I? No, I didn't. Lord. That's exactly a little Donald Byrd here. But because that's what I would like to say, you know. Because to be on that tightrope means that each one of us have a different kind of timing. Because we're unique, we're distinctive. It's just like our fingerprints. There's only one of us in the history of the cosmos, which means that as we make it on that tightrope, we're trying to learn from others and the dead, and at the same time be able to stay on it enough so that we're not so overwhelmed. There's a wonderful line also in Eliot, human beings can only stand so much reality. Ooh, very similar to Eugene O'Neill. Interesting. You know, they were born just 20 days apart from each other. In 1888, same moment, very different, trying to stay on the tightrope. One can't, the other one barely hanging on for dear life. I mean, Eliot's life is a very sad life. It's a very sad life, and yet it's still quite gallant. Eugene's very, very sad, but still quite gallant. There's a sadness in all of our lives. Very, very deep, and it cuts very deep. But I think in the end, it's going to be a matter of being connected to friends, family, people who care about you, so you can sustain your movement. I remember one last thing I'll say about Stephen Sondheim. You know, when I first met him, and we were interviewed, Brother Tavis, on the show, and he told me, he said, you know, I was the only child, and when I was about 20-some years old, my mother went into the hospital, and the doctor told her she was going to have a heart surgery, and she had a 30% chance to live. And he said, you better write whatever notes you have to your loved ones, because there's a good chance you won't make it. And she said, I have one sentence to write. She took pen on the paper. She said, this is to my son Stephen. I have no regrets in life other than giving birth to you. That's not funny. That's not funny at all. I told Brother Sondheim, I said, brother, I've been a black man in America for 65 years. I've never experienced that level of existential catastrophe, because my mama loved me. And Dad did too. Uncle Earl did, Aunt Payne did, and Granddad and so forth. How'd you make it all by yourself, Sondheim? Listen to some of that music. And Oscar Hammerstein II adopts him as a surrogate father, but just for a while, before he goes to Williams and then Princeton. But he's in the world all by himself. And he doesn't fall in love until he's 60 years old. He's a gay brother. He finally falls in love. He doesn't write for a long time. Reminds you of Ian Foster. Similar. Never the same, but similar. You know, I've said what I got to say. I got my love. Let me live my life. We appreciate it. We appreciate it. That's a level of each life being so different. Who would have thought that a Sondheim, all the money he had and so forth, and here I broke the Ten Commandments financially, you know, I'm interacting with him, and I'm walking around much more privileged emotionally, psychically, spiritually than this white brother, even though he got all this money. But look what he gives to the world. Himself. Unbelievable. And I just used that briefly. But we got one last question with our young brother. There you go, yeah.
So throughout these lectures, you've talked about Nietzsche a lot, or Nietzschean moments.
Yes,
and
yes.
I think it was in the first or the second lecture that you had the observation that Socrates never weeps, but Jesus never laughs. And just to connect those two threads, there was a moment that always stuck out to me in Nietzsche, and Thus Spoke Zarathustra, where it's very parallel to Moses coming down from the mountain and giving his laws. And when Zarathustra, Nietzsche's prophet, is the same. When their followers don't listen to it, in Moses' case with the golden calf, and he has them killed, but with Zarathustra, he just laughs. You know, it's a moment of laughter. But, and I'd never thought about this in this way before these lectures, but in a sense, I thought like maybe Nietzsche was making Moses laugh or making Jesus laugh, and I just wondered what you thought about that subversion and just of laughter in general in Nietzsche.
That's a beautiful way of putting it, though, brother. That's a beautiful way of putting it. But again, laughter is one thing in many things. There's a sense in which these brothers in the Harry Hope Saloon are still in Plato's cave. And a whole lot of laughter is taking place. That's not Nietzschean laughter. That's the laughter among the shadows in the dark. That's a very different status in that way, you see. The laughter you get in Lucy and the laughter you get in Erasmus, ooh, that's an elevated laughter. And again, Rabelais, he's beyond category, as Duke Ellington said about Ella Fitzgerald, right? His laughter is very different. And Bakhtin, Mikhail Bakhtin and others have talked about this philosophical laughter that's different than the laughter in the cave and the laughter that one may get on the edges of those who are going back to it and so forth. But again, it's a kind of joyous freedom and a laughter that you hope is also tied to a sensitivity. Because when Nietzsche wrote his first book, Birth of Tragedy, and what did he want? He wanted a Socrates who was artistic, a Socrates that might even dance. Socrates does dance in Xenophon's rendering of him, not in Plato's. Very interesting. Which Socrates are we talking about? Socrates never wrote a word. Got a lot of critical appropriations of him. Maybe he was dancing all the time. Maybe he was laughing all the time. Plato, how come you didn't tell the full truth? Look at Gilbert Keith Chesterton. Spends so much of his career doing what? Talking about the mirth of Jesus, the laughter of Christ. Chesterton, are you pushing it because you are such a philosopher of wonder and laughter? You want your Savior to be like you? Sounds Feuerbachian to me. You're projecting. But I love Chesterton's effort. Because it would be nice to think that Jesus is turning this, water into wine and has a wonderful laugh and so forth and so on. But who knows? Who knows? That's part of the joy of the whole discussion. In the end, it's going to be how much love, how much courage, how much vision, how much sacrifice, how much service, and how much fun you're having. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you so much, Professor West, for responding to those questions. Excellent questions, all of them. And I'm sorry if we didn't manage to get around the room, but you couldn't go on to our Gifford series blog and continue the conversation there, providing comments and engaging with the the summaries of each lecture, which are appearing there. This is, of course, the penultimate lecture. The final lecture tomorrow will be, not tomorrow, sorry. The final lecture on Thursday will be in the Informatics Center, the Informatics Forum, so it will be, as it were, in the center, the George Square part of the campus. And yeah, my final thoughts here are to thank everyone for engaging, to thank Glowcast, who've been doing the live streaming, to thank all those others behind the scene who make these lectures run smoothly. They've done an amazing job. The lecture recordings will be available very soon on the website, and you'll be able to find details of that. So,
Should we say something about the royal thing on Wednesday night?
sorry?
The seminar on Wednesday night?
No, I think it's
Oh,
probably
is that
sold
closed?
out.
Is that closed?
Sold out.
Oh, then I didn't say anything.
Sold out.
Yeah,
Sold
it's
out.
already sold out. Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay, so there will be live streaming of the Gifford seminar, which will be tomorrow at 6 o'clock, is it? Or 5 o'clock? 6 o'clock? 6 o'clock at the, yeah, so there will be live streaming of that as well. So you can register for the live streaming via the Royal Society of Edinburgh website. Yeah. Okay, so thank you very much for that, Jay Brown. And again, thank you.